The thundering locomotive whistle pierced the hot Montana air as Dawson Lawson squinted against the sun. His weathered Stetson pulled low over eyes that had seen more than their fair share of both beauty and bloodshed. Stillwater Station hadn't changed much in the 7 years he'd been gone. Same rickety platform, same peeling paint on the depot sign, same dust devils dancing across the tracks. But Dawson wasn't the same man who'd left this place with nothing but heartache and a promise to never return. The year was 1885, and the untamed West was slowly yielding to the relentless march of civilization. Dawson had ridden with the best of them, driven cattle from Texas to Montana, faced down outlaws, and somehow lived to tell the tales. But no adventure had ever matched the wild beating of his heart as the train pulled into the station, belching black smoke against the endless blue sky. He knew she was on that train. Katherine Lowell. The only woman who'd ever truly known him, the only one who'd seen past the gun on his hip and the hardness in his eyes to the man beneath. Passengers began to disembark, city folk mostly, holding handkerchiefs to their noses against the dust and smell of cattle. Dawson stood apart from the small gathering crowd, his tall frame leaning against a post, trying to appear casual while his heart threatened to gallop right out of his chest. And then she was there. Katherine stepped onto the platform, and time seemed to fold in on itself. Her chestnut hair was swept up beneath a modest traveling hat, her blue dress simple but elegant. She looked different, more refined than the wild-spirited girl he'd known, yet unmistakably the same. She paused, scanning the platform, one gloved hand shielding her eyes from the sun. Their gazes locked across the crowded platform, and Dawson felt the world tilt beneath his boots for a moment. Neither moved. Then Katherine's lips parted, a small breath escaping as recognition dawned. 7 years dissolved in an instant. Dawson pushed away from the post and moved toward her, weaving through the crowd with single-minded purpose. He stopped before her, removing his hat, suddenly unsure what to say to the woman he'd loved and lost. "Miss Lowell," he managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "Mr. Lawson," she replied, her voice carrying the slightest tremor. "I didn't expect to see you here." The formality between them was a physical pain. There had been a time when they'd shared everything: dreams, fears, the sweetness of first love. "I heard you were coming home," he said simply. A porter approached, struggling with a large trunk. Katherine turned, reaching for her purse, but Dawson stepped forward. "I'll take that," he said, handing the man a coin. With ease born from years of physical labor, he hoisted the heavy trunk onto his shoulder. "Where are you staying?" "My aunt's house on Willow Street," she said, a flicker of something gratitude, remembrance in her eyes. "It's not far. I know the place." Of course he did. He'd stood beneath her window more nights than he cared to remember, a lovesick boy of 20 dreaming of forever with the judge's daughter. They walked in silence down the main street of Stillwater, the midday sun beating down on them. Dawson was acutely aware of every inch of space between them, of the curious glances from townsfolk who remembered their history, of Katherine's perfume carried on the warm breeze. "You've been well?" she asked finally. "Well enough." He adjusted the trunk. "Ran cattle up in Wyoming for a spell. Then did some work for the territorial marshal." "So you became a lawman after all," she said softly. "Deputy," he corrected. "For 3 years, hung up the badge last winter." She nodded, her eyes on the dusty road ahead. "And now I'm back." He didn't elaborate. Couldn't tell her that he'd returned because rumors had reached him that she was coming home after her husband's death. That he'd spent the last 6 months building a ranch outside of town, preparing for a chance he'd never thought he'd get. They turned onto Willow Street, lined with the finest homes in Stillwater. Judge Lowell's house, now belonging to Katherine's aunt, since the judge's passing 4 years prior, stood proud among them, with its white painted fence and wraparound porch. Dawson carried the trunk up the steps, setting it down gently on the porch. Katherine removed her gloves, tucking them into her small handbag. "Thank you," she said. "For the help." "Katherine," he started, then faltered, years of practiced words abandoning him. "I just wanted to say." The front door swung open, and an older woman appeared, her face lighting up at the sight of Katherine. "You're here at last. The train was on time for once." She embraced Katherine warmly before turning curious eyes to Dawson. "Aunt Harriet, you remember Dawson Lawson," Katherine said. Recognition flashed across the older woman's face. "The rancher's boy. Yes, of course." Her tone cooled noticeably. The Lawsons had never been good enough for the Lowells in her estimation. "Madam," Dawson nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "I should be going." "Thank you again," Katherine said, her expression unreadable. Dawson tipped his hat and turned to leave, but something made him pause at the top of the steps. He turned back, gathering his courage. "Katherine," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "I know it's been a long time and I know things ended badly between us, but I'd like to call on you if you'd allow it." Her eyes widened slightly, but before she could respond, her aunt called from inside the house. "Katherine, come in. The tea is getting cold." Katherine hesitated, torn between past and present. "Sunday," she said finally. "After church, we could talk then." It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Dawson nodded, unable to suppress the smile that tugged at his lips. "Sunday," he agreed. He descended the porch steps, feeling lighter than he had in years. The road ahead would not be easy. Too much history. Too many wounds still unhealed, but for the first time since he'd ridden away from Stillwater 7 years ago, Dawson Lawson dared to hope. Katherine watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Her hands trembled as she closed the front door, leaning against it for a moment to steady herself. She had returned to Stillwater to start anew, to find peace after 3 years of a difficult marriage and a year of mourning. The last thing she had expected was to come face to face with Dawson Lawson on her very first day back. "Katherine, dear, are you coming?" Aunt Harriet called from the parlor. "Yes, just a moment." She removed her hat, smoothing her hair with shaking fingers. 7 years. 7 years since she'd last seen him, since her father had forced them apart, threatening to ruin the Lawson family if Dawson didn't leave town. 7 years since she'd married Thomas Bradford, a man 20 years her senior, to save her family from financial ruin after her father's disastrous investments. And now Dawson was back, looking at her with those same eyes that had once promised her the world. Sunday suddenly seemed very far away. The church bell rang out across Stillwater, calling the faithful to worship on a bright Sunday morning. Dawson sat in the back pew, hat in his hands, uncomfortably aware of the stares and whispers. He hadn't set foot in this church since the Sunday before he'd left town, when he'd watched from this very pew as Judge Lowell announced his daughter's engagement to Thomas Bradford. He fixed his eyes on the back of Katherine's head, several rows ahead where she sat with her aunt. Her hair was pinned up elegantly beneath a small hat, exposing the graceful curve of her neck. Dawson tried to focus on Reverend Miller's sermon, but his mind kept drifting to what he would say when they were finally alone. When the service ended, he waited outside, nodding politely to those who recognized him. Most folks were cordial enough, curious about his return but maintaining a respectful distance. In a town like Stillwater, everyone knew everyone's business, and everyone remembered how the judge had run off the Lawson boy who dared to court his daughter. Katherine emerged from the church beside her aunt, and Dawson's breath caught at the sight of her in the full light of day. She wore a dress of soft green that brought out the amber flecks in her eyes that found his immediately across the churchyard. She murmured something to her aunt, who frowned but nodded, watching with open disapproval as Katherine made her way toward Dawson. "Good morning," she said when she reached him, her voice formal but her eyes searching his. "Morning," he replied. "I was thinking we might walk down by the creek if that suits you." She nodded, and they set off together, maintaining a proper distance between them as they made their way through town and toward the small creek that wound its way behind the schoolhouse. It was a familiar path. They had walked it countless times in their youth, when Katherine would sneak away from her piano lessons, and Dawson would meet her with wildflowers clutched in his sun-browned hand. When they reached the creek, Dawson helped her down the small embankment, her hand warm and small in his. They found a fallen log to sit on, the same one they had carved their initials into as teenagers, now weathered by time and elements. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Dawson said finally, breaking the silence between them. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. "But I wanted to see you." To talk to you. She smoothed her skirts, a nervous gesture he remembered well. You've changed. He smiled slightly. So have you. Yes. She looked out over the creek, watching the sunlight dance on the water. Life has a way of changing us, doesn't it? Katherine, he began, turning to face her fully. I need to know, did you ever get my letters? She stiffened, her eyes widening. Letters? What letters? Dawson's jaw tightened. I wrote to you, every month for the first year after I left, when you never replied, I thought. I thought you'd chosen to forget me. I never received any letters, she whispered, the color draining from her face. My father told me you left without a word, that you'd found better prospects elsewhere. When I confronted him about the threats he'd made to your family, he denied everything. And you believed him. The words came out harsher than he intended. Katherine's eyes flashed. What choice did I have? You were gone. My father was ruined financially, his investments had failed, we were about to lose everything. Thomas Bradford offered to save us from disgrace, to care for my father in his illness. I did what I had to do. Dawson absorbed this, the anger he'd carried for years giving way to understanding. Judge Lowell had been more thorough in his manipulation than Dawson had realized. I'm sorry, he said finally. I shouldn't have doubted you. I knew your father was determined to keep us apart, but I never imagined he'd go so far. He was. Desperate, Katherine said, though her voice held little conviction. After Mother died, something changed in him. His judgment became clouded. He made bad investments, trusted the wrong people. And he saw me as just another bad investment, Dawson concluded. A distraction, she corrected gently. A complication in his plans to restore our family's position. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past settling between them. Were you happy? Dawson asked finally, the question that had haunted him for years. With Bradford, Katherine considered her answer carefully. Thomas was kind in his way. He never loved me, not really. I was a young wife to enhance his standing, to give him heirs. She paused. Which I failed to do, but he wasn't cruel. When he died last year, I mourned him appropriately. But were you happy? Dawson pressed. She met his gaze directly. No, she said simply. I was not happy. The honesty between them felt like the first clear breath after years of suffocation. What about you? She asked. In your travels, did you find someone who made you happy? No, he answered without hesitation. There's only ever been you, Katherine. Her eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. We were so young then, Dawson, just children playing at forever. I wasn't playing, he said quietly. Every promise I made you, I meant to keep. A bird called overhead, breaking the moment. Katherine stood, smoothing her skirts again. We should head back. Aunt Harriet will be sending out a search party soon. Dawson stood as well, towering over her slight frame. Can I see you again? She hesitated, and for a moment he feared she would refuse. But then she nodded. I'd like that, perhaps. Perhaps you could call at the house tomorrow afternoon. Aunt Harriet has her ladies' society meeting. We could talk more freely. Tomorrow then, he agreed, hope blooming in his chest. They walked back toward town in companionable silence, both lost in thoughts of what had been and what might yet be. As they reached the edge of town, Katherine paused. Dawson, whatever happens, I want you to know that I never stopped thinking about you. Even when I thought you'd forgotten me, even when I was Thomas's wife, you were always there, in the back of my mind, in the quiet moments. Before he could respond, she turned and walked quickly toward her aunt's house, leaving Dawson standing in the street, his heart pounding with renewed purpose. The next day dawned clear and bright, the Montana summer in full bloom. Dawson rose early, tending to his horses and the small herd of cattle he'd started with money saved from his deputy's pay. The ranch was modest, just a sturdy cabin, a corral and a barn, but it was his, built with his own hands on land he'd purchased fair and square. As he worked, his mind kept returning to Katherine, to the revelation that she had never received his letters, that she had believed he'd abandoned her without a word. The thought of those lost years gnawed at him, but there was hope now too, a second chance he'd never thought possible. By mid-afternoon, he'd bathed and changed into his best shirt, a deep blue cotton that Katherine had once said brought out the color of his eyes. He saddled his roan gelding and rode into town, his stomach knotted with anticipation. The Lowell house looked peaceful in the afternoon sun. Dawson tied his horse to the hitching post and approached the front door, hesitating only briefly before knocking. Katherine answered almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting nearby. She wore a simple dress of pale yellow, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he'd rarely seen since they were teenagers. "You came," she said, a smile brightening her face. "I said I would." He removed his hat, suddenly uncertain. "Is your aunt?" "Gone for at least 2 hours," Katherine confirmed, stepping back to allow him entry. "Please come in." The house was cool and quiet, furnished with the elegant pieces he remembered from the judge's day, though somewhat fewer in number. Katherine led him to the parlor, where a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses waited on a small table. "You've been busy, I hear," she said as they sat. "Mrs. Peterson at the general store tells me you've built yourself a ranch north of town." Dawson nodded, accepting the glass she offered. "Nothing fancy, but it's good land. Plenty of water, good grazing, room to grow." "And is that your plan, to grow your ranch?" "It was," he said carefully. "Now I'm not so sure." Their eyes met over the rims of their glasses, and the years between them seemed to melt away. "Katherine," he began, setting down his glass, "I need to know what you want, why you came back to Stillwater." She took a deep breath. "After Thomas died, I stayed in Helena for a time. His business associates and their wives were kind, but I was always an outsider. The young widow they pitied but never truly accepted." She twisted the handkerchief in her lap. "When Aunt Harriet wrote that she was lonely, that she wished I would come home, it seemed like Providence opening a door. And now that you're here," he prompted when she fell silent, "now I feel as though I've been given a second chance at life," she said softly. "I'm only 25, Dawson. For the first time since I was 18, I can make my own choices. And what do you choose?" He held his breath, afraid to hope too much. Katherine set aside her handkerchief and looked directly at him, her gaze steady. "I choose to be honest with myself and with you. I never stopped loving you, Dawson. Even when I thought you had forgotten me, even when I stood before God and promised myself to another man, my heart remained yours." The words hung in the air between them, a confession 7 years in the making. Dawson moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "Katherine Lowell, I have loved you since we were children. I loved you when I rode away from this town with nothing but the clothes on my back and your father's threats ringing in my ears. I loved you through every mile, every job, every night under strange stars. And I love you now, more than ever." Tears spilled onto her cheeks. "How can we start again after everything? After all this time, we start right here," he said, reaching up to brush the tears from her face. "We start by forgiving the past and believing in the future. We start with this." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question more than a demand. But when Katherine's arms wound around his neck, when she pressed closer with a small sound of surrender, the years of longing broke free. They pulled apart only when the need for air became desperate, foreheads touching, breath mingling. "I never thought I would feel this again," Katherine whispered, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Neither did I," he admitted. "I tried to forget you, Katherine. God knows I tried, but you're carved into my soul." A clock chimed somewhere in the house, breaking the spell. Katherine pulled back slightly, though she kept her hands on his shoulders. "Aunt Harriet will be home soon," she said regretfully. Dawson nodded, rising to his feet and helping her up. "When can I see you again?" "Tomorrow," she suggested. "We could ride out to see your ranch. I'd like to see what you've built." The idea of Katherine at his home, seeing the life he'd created with her always in his thoughts, filled him with both excitement and nervousness. "I'd like that. I'll come for you mid-morning if that suits." "Perfect," she smiled, walking him to the door. At the threshold, he turned back to her. "Katherine, I want you to know I'm not the same hot-headed boy who left here 7 years ago. I've learned patience. I can wait as long as you need." She touched his cheek gently. "And I'm not the same girl who let others make her choices. This time I choose my own path." She stretched up on tiptoe to press a quick kiss to his lips. "And I choose you, Dawson Lawson. I always have." With those words warming his heart, Dawson left the Lowell house and headed back to his ranch, plans already forming in his mind for tomorrow's visit. Katherine stood at the window, watching Dawson ride away, her fingers pressed to lips that still tingled from his kiss. For the first time in 7 years, she felt truly alive, as though a dormant part of her had suddenly awakened. The dutiful daughter, the proper young wife, the grieving widow, all of those women seemed like strangers now. With Dawson's return, she had found herself again. A sound at the front door announced Aunt Harriet's return. Katherine quickly moved away from the window and picked up her embroidery, assuming an expression of peaceful industriousness as her aunt entered the parlor. "There you are, dear. Were you terribly bored without me?" Aunt Harriet removed her hat, eyeing the 2 lemonade glasses on the table. "Not at all," Katherine replied evenly. "I had a visitor." "That Lawson boy," Aunt Harriet said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a question. "Mrs. Henderson saw his horse tied outside our gate." Katherine set down her embroidery. "Dawson came to call, yes, we had a pleasant conversation." Aunt Harriet sat heavily in her chair, removing her gloves with deliberate care. "Katherine, I understand that you're a grown woman and a widow besides, but I feel I must caution you. That young man broke your heart once before." "No, Aunt," Katherine said firmly. "My father broke my heart when he forced Dawson away and intercepted his letters, when he made me believe that Dawson had abandoned me without a word." Aunt Harriet's eyes widened. "Letters? What letters?" "Dawson wrote to me every month for a year after he left. I never received a single one." Katherine's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "My father made sure of that." I had no idea," Aunt Harriet murmured, genuine shock in her expression. "Your father never said anything about letters." "There's a great deal my father never said," Katherine replied. "But that's in the past now. Dawson has invited me to see his ranch tomorrow, and I've accepted." Aunt Harriet looked as though she wanted to object, but something in Katherine's face made her reconsider. "Just be careful, my dear. Not for propriety's sake, though there will be talk, but for your heart's sake. You've been through so much already." Katherine softened, reaching over to pat her aunt's hand. "I appreciate your concern, truly I do. But for the first time in my adult life, I'm making my own choice, following my own heart. Can you understand how important that is to me?" After a long moment, Aunt Harriet nodded. "I suppose I can. Your mother would have approved, you know. She always thought Edward was too harsh with you." She sighed. "Very well, go see this ranch tomorrow, but take the buggy at least. A lady doesn't arrive on horseback." Katherine smiled, grateful for this small victory. "Thank you, Aunt Harriet." That night, Katherine lay awake in her childhood bedroom, moonlight streaming through the lace curtains as memories and hopes tangled together in her mind. Tomorrow she would see Dawson's ranch, the life he had built. Tomorrow they would begin to discover if the love they had shared as youths could withstand the test of time and experience. The following morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect Montana summer day. Katherine dressed with care in a practical riding skirt and jacket of deep burgundy, her hair braided and pinned to withstand the journey. When Dawson arrived with his wagon rather than riding horseback, Katherine was touched by his thoughtfulness. He had anticipated that she might not wish to ride astride all the way to his ranch. Aunt Harriet watched from the porch as Dawson helped Katherine into the wagon, her expression a mixture of concern and resignation. "Have her back before dark, Mr. Lawson," she called. "Yes, madam," Dawson replied respectfully, tipping his hat before climbing up beside Katherine. As they drove through town, Katherine was acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk, the whispers that would undoubtedly follow. Stillwater had a long memory, and the romance between Judge Lowell's daughter and the rancher's son had been the subject of gossip for months after Dawson's abrupt departure. "People are staring," she murmured, Dawson's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Let them stare. We're not doing anything wrong." "No, we're not," she agreed, lifting her chin slightly. "Though I suspect Mrs. Whitmore will have this reported to every member of the Ladies' Aid Society before noon." "Probably," he chuckled. "Does that bother you?" Katherine considered the question. "It would have once now. Now I find I care far less about what others think." "That's my girl," he said softly, and the casual possessiveness sent a shiver of pleasure through her. They left the town behind, following the winding road north along the river. The land opened up before them, vast and beautiful, the distant mountains sharp against the clear blue sky. Katherine breathed deeply, feeling the tension of the past weeks of the past years begin to melt away. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it is here," she said, gazing out at the rolling landscape. "Most beautiful country in the world," Dawson agreed. "I've seen a fair bit of it, and nothing compares." "Tell me about your travels," she urged, genuinely curious about the years they'd spent apart. As the wagon rolled on, Dawson told her stories of cattle drives through Texas, of the mining camps in Colorado, of the 2 years he'd spent as a deputy in Wyoming. He spoke of blizzards that had nearly killed him, of outlaws he'd helped bring to justice, of the long, lonely nights under the stars. "And through it all, I kept thinking of coming back here, of building something lasting," he said, as they turned onto a smaller track that led away from the main road. "I saved every penny I could, worked extra jobs, took on the dangerous assignments other deputies avoided. Every dollar got me closer to having enough to buy land here. You always wanted your own ranch," Katherine remembered. "Even when we were young, you talked about it." "I wanted it for us," he corrected gently. "Every dream I ever had included you, Katherine." Before she could respond, they crested a small rise, and Dawson's ranch came into view. It was modest, but well-built, a sturdy log cabin with a covered porch, a large barn, and several corrals where horses grazed peacefully. Beyond, she could see cattle dotting the hillside and a creek winding its way through the property. "Oh, Dawson," she breathed, "it's wonderful." Pride was evident in his voice as he pointed out the features of his land: the natural spring that never ran dry, the sheltered valley where the cattle could weather the harsh Montana winters, the stand of timber he'd been selectively harvesting for additional income. As they drew closer to the cabin, Katherine noticed the details: the carefully tended flower beds along the front, the rocking chairs on the porch, the curtains visible through the windows. "Did you do all this yourself?" she asked as he helped her down from the wagon. "Most of it," he nodded. "Had help with the barn raising from neighbors, the Johnsons from the next property over, the Millers from town." "It's more than I expected," she admitted, following him up the steps to the porch. He paused at the door, suddenly hesitant. "It's not fancy like you're used to." Katherine shook her head. "It's real, honest, built with your own hands." She looked up at him. "That means more than all the fancy parlors in Helena." Relief washed over his features as he opened the door and gestured for her to enter. The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable: a large main room with a stone fireplace, a solid table with 4 chairs, bookshelves filled with volumes that surprised her, a comfortable-looking sofa covered in a quilt she recognized as Mrs. Lawson's handiwork. "Your mother's quilt," she said, touching it gently. "She sent it when I wrote that I'd bought the land," Dawson explained. "She and Pa are doing well in Oregon. Pa's lungs are much better in that climate." "I'm glad," Katherine said sincerely, remembering how Mr. Lawson's coal mining days had left him with a persistent cough that the Montana winters had only worsened. "They must be proud of what you've accomplished here." "They want to visit next spring," he said, watching her as she explored the room. "They'd be happy to see you again." "I'd like that," she smiled, moving to examine the bookshelves. "You've quite a library, Mr. Lawson. I don't recall you being such an avid reader." A faint blush colored his tan cheeks. "Had a lot of long nights with no company but my thoughts. Reading helped pass the time, and I found I enjoyed it more than I expected." She ran her fingers along the spine's history, poetry, novels, even several books on law and animal husbandry. "A man of hidden depths." "Not so hidden," he said quietly. "You always saw more in me than others did." Their eyes met across the room, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Katherine was the first to look away, moving toward the small kitchen area. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the space. "Make yourself at home," he invited. The kitchen was neat and functional: a cast iron stove, a pump for water, shelves stocked with basic supplies. Through an open door, she glimpsed a bedroom with a large bed covered in another quilt, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. "It's a good home, Dawson," she said, turning back to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You've built something to be proud of." "It's missing something important," he replied, taking a step closer. "Oh, what's that?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "You," he said simply. "It was always meant for you, Katherine. Every nail, every board, every acre, I built it all with you in mind." The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Katherine felt tears prick her eyes. "Dawson, I'm not asking for anything right now," he said quickly. "I know it's too soon. You've only been back a few days, and there's so much we need to learn about each other again. I just wanted you to see it, to understand what I've been working toward all these years." Katherine crossed the room to stand before him, taking his rough hands in her smaller ones. "Thank you for showing me, for trusting me with your dreams." He bent his head, resting his forehead against hers. "They're still our dreams, if you want them to be." Instead of answering with words, Katherine tilted her face up and kissed him, pouring 7 years of longing into the gesture. Dawson responded immediately, his arms encircling her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Dawson looked dazed, his eyes dark with emotion. "I should show you the rest of the ranch," he said hoarsely. Katherine laughed, the sound bright and carefree. "Yes, I think that would be wise, before we forget ourselves entirely." He smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear with gentle fingers. "I've waited 7 years. I can wait a bit longer to do things properly." "Properly," she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "And what does that entail exactly?" "Courting you the way you deserve," he said seriously. "Calling at your aunt's house, taking you to dinner at the hotel, church socials, giving the town time to get used to seeing us together again." "And then," she prompted, his eyes held her steadily. "And then, when the time is right, I'm going to ask you to be my wife. To share this home and this life with me. To let me keep the promise I made when we were young." "Forever," she whispered, remembering his words from long ago. "Forever," he confirmed. The moment stretched between them, full of promise and possibility. Then Dawson stepped back, offering his arm with a smile. "Now, I believe I promised you a tour of my humble empire, Mrs. Bradford. Lead the way, Mr. Lawson," she replied, taking his arm. "I find I'm most eager to see everything." They spent the remainder of the day exploring the ranch, Dawson showing her his prized horses, the new calves, the garden he'd started behind the house. They picnicked by the creek, talking for hours about their separate lives and their shared dreams, rediscovering each other as the adults they had become rather than the teenagers they had been. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Dawson reluctantly helped Katherine back into the wagon for the return journey to town. "I wish we had more time," he said, settling beside her on the seat. "We have time now," she reminded him, her hand finding his. "All the time we need." The weeks that followed fell into a pleasant pattern. True to his word, Dawson courted Katherine properly, calling at her aunt's house, escorting her to church, taking her to dinner at the Grand Hotel where they had once sneaked in to watch the dancing from the balcony. Slowly, the town's initial shock at their reunion gave way to acceptance, and even a certain romantic approval. The story of their youthful love, torn apart by the judge's interference and rekindled years later, appealed to even the most hardened hearts in Stillwater. Even Aunt Harriet softened her stance as she observed the care and respect with which Dawson treated her niece, and the genuine happiness that radiated from Katherine whenever he was near. Summer gave way to autumn, the land transformed by vibrant golds and reds before the first snow dusted the mountains. Through it all, Dawson and Katherine grew closer, their love deepening as they built new memories while honoring the past they shared. On a crisp October evening, Dawson invited Katherine to dinner at his ranch. With Aunt Harriet's somewhat reluctant blessing, secured after Dawson promised to have Katherine home at a respectable hour, he collected her in his wagon, a nervous energy about him that Katherine found endearing. The cabin looked different in the gathering dusk. Warm light spilled from the windows, and smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. As Dawson helped her down, Katherine noticed that the porch had been swept clean, and a new rocking chair had appeared beside the existing one. Inside, the transformation was even more apparent. The table was set with what she recognized as Dawson's best dishes, a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers at its center. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, and delicious smells wafted from the kitchen area. "You've been busy," she remarked, removing her shawl. "I wanted everything to be perfect," he admitted, taking the shawl and hanging it carefully by the door. "It is," she assured him, touched by his efforts. "Did you cook?" He grinned. "I've learned a few things over the years. Nothing fancy, but I promise it's edible." The meal was simple but delicious: venison stew, fresh bread, and apple pie that he confessed Mrs. Johnson from the neighboring ranch had contributed to the evening. They talked easily, comfortable in each other's company after months of renewed courtship. After dinner, they moved to sit before the fire, the autumn chill making the warmth especially welcome. Dawson seemed preoccupied, his responses slightly distracted as Katherine told him about the plans for the upcoming harvest festival. "Dawson, is something wrong?" she finally asked, concerned by his unusual behavior. He started, then smiled ruefully. "Not wrong, just, I had a plan for tonight and I'm making a mess of it." "A plan," she echoed, her pulse quickening. Dawson took a deep breath, then slid from the sofa to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "Katherine Lowell, I have loved you since I was 16 years old. I loved you when we were forced apart. I loved you when I thought I'd lost you forever. And I love you now, more deeply than I ever thought possible." Tears filled Katherine's eyes as she realized what was happening. "7 years ago, I made you a promise," he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I promised that one day I would build a home for us, a place where we could live and love and raise a family together. I promised you forever." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a delicate ring with a single perfect diamond. "I'm asking you to let me keep that promise, to be my wife, my partner, my heart's companion for all the days we have left on this earth." Katherine could barely see through her tears, but her voice was clear and certain. "Yes, Dawson, yes, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "My mother sent it when I wrote to tell her I'd found you again." "It's beautiful," she whispered. Admiring the way the firelight caught in the diamond, Dawson rose, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. "You're beautiful," he corrected, his eyes drinking in her face as though memorizing every detail. "And I am the luckiest man alive." Their kiss was both a seal on their promise and a beginning, tender yet passionate, filled with all the love they had carried for each other through years of separation. When they finally drew apart, Katherine rested her head against Dawson's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "When?" she asked simply. "As soon as you want," he replied, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her back. "Tomorrow, next month, next spring, whenever you're ready." She looked up at him, her decision already made. "Christmas," she said. "A Christmas wedding here at the ranch." Surprise and joy lit his features. "Here, are you sure? We could have it in town at the church." Katherine shook her head. "This is our home, Dawson. This is where our life together will be. I want to begin it here, surrounded by what you've built for us." "Christmas it is," he agreed, sealing the decision with another kiss. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Stillwater, met with a mixture of delight, astonishment, and from a few quarters disapproval at the speed with which the widow Bradford had allowed herself to be courted. But Katherine found that she cared little for the opinions of those who had never known the truth of her first marriage or the depth of her love for Dawson. Aunt Harriet, after an initial period of concern, threw herself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm, declaring that her niece would have the finest celebration Stillwater had ever seen, even if it was to be held at her ranch rather than in town. As November arrived with its shorter days and increasing cold, Katherine divided her time between her aunt's house and Dawson's ranch, helping to prepare their home for both the wedding and their life together. They expanded the garden plot for the spring planting, selected furniture from the Lowell house to complement what Dawson already had, and spent long evenings planning for the future. "I was thinking," Dawson said one evening as they sat before the fire, Katherine's head resting on his shoulder as she examined fabric swatches for new curtains. "What if we added on to the cabin next summer, a proper dining room, maybe another bedroom or two, for the children we might have?" she asked, looking up at him with a smile. "For our children," he nodded, his eyes soft with longing. I want a family with you, Catherine, boys with your smile, girls with your spirit, and all of them with your good heart," she added, reaching up to touch his cheek. "Yes, I think we should plan for additional rooms, but the cabin is perfect for now, for the beginning." December arrived with a heavy snowfall that transformed the landscape into a glistening wonderland. Christmas was just 2 weeks away, and preparations for the wedding were nearly complete. Catherine had chosen a dress of ivory satin. Aunt Harriet had arranged for Reverend Miller to perform the ceremony, and invitations had been sent to everyone in Stillwater, as well as to Dawson's parents in Oregon. On a clear, cold afternoon, Dawson drove Catherine back to town after a day spent decorating the cabin with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. As they approached Stillwater, they could see the train pulled into the station, passengers disembarking onto the platform. "The evening train's early," Dawson remarked, slowing the horses as they passed the depot. Catherine was about to respond when her eye caught a familiar figure standing on the platform beside a large trunk. She gasped, clutching Dawson's arm. "What is it?" he asked, instantly alert. "It's them," she whispered. "Dawson, it's your parents." He followed her gaze, his face lighting up with surprise and joy. "Pa, Ma," he called, bringing the wagon to a halt and jumping down. Mrs. Lawson turned at the sound of her son's voice, her weathered face breaking into a smile of pure delight. "Dawson, oh my boy." Dawson swept his mother into a bear hug, lifting her off her feet while his father clapped him on the back, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Catherine watched from the wagon, tears of happiness blurring her vision as Dawson embraced the parents he hadn't seen in 7 years. Then Mrs. Lawson pulled back, looking past her son to where Catherine sat. "Is that her?" she asked, though it was clear she already knew the answer. "Is that our Catherine?" Dawson turned, extending his hand to help Catherine down from the wagon. "Ma, Pa, you remember Katherine Lowell." "Bradford," Catherine corrected gently, "though not for much longer." Mrs. Lawson enveloped her in a warm hug that smelled of lavender and home. "We never gave up hope, you know," she whispered in Catherine's ear. "Even when Dawson wrote that you'd married another, I told him, that girl loves you, son. Some things are meant to be." "You were right," Catherine whispered back, returning the embrace with equal fervor. Mr. Lawson, his face more lined than Catherine remembered but his eyes still kind, took her hand in his. "It's good to see you again, Miss Catherine. Our boy's been happier in his letters these past months than I've seen him in years." "He makes me very happy too, Mr. Lawson," she assured him. "We weren't expecting you until next week," Dawson said, moving to hoist his father's trunk onto his shoulder with ease. "The wedding's not until Christmas Day." "We decided to come early," Mrs. Lawson explained, taking her husband's arm, "to help with the preparations and to spend some time with you both before the big day. If that's all right." "It's more than all right," Dawson grinned, loading the trunk into the wagon. "It's perfect." Catherine agreed wholeheartedly. Having the Lawsons arrive early felt right, as though the final pieces of a long, incomplete puzzle were falling into place. "You'll stay at the ranch, of course," Dawson was saying as he helped his mother into the wagon. "The spare room is all ready." "Oh, but we don't want to impose," Mrs. Lawson protested. "We could stay at the hotel." "Nonsense," Catherine said firmly. "The ranch is your son's home and soon to be mine. There's no imposition in having you there." The decision made, they set off toward Aunt Harriet's house first, to inform her of the change in plans and to collect a few of Catherine's things. To everyone's surprise, Aunt Harriet insisted on joining them for dinner at the ranch, eager to become better acquainted with her future nieces-in-laws. As the expanded party made their way to the ranch in the gathering dusk, snow beginning to fall gently around them, Catherine felt a sense of rightness, of coming full circle. 7 years ago, she had lost everything that mattered. Now, sitting beside Dawson, surrounded by family both old and new, she had found it all again and more besides. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity and joy. Mrs. Lawson and Aunt Harriet, initially wary of each other, soon found common ground in their shared love for Dawson and Catherine, becoming unexpected allies in the wedding preparations. Mr. Lawson, whose health had indeed improved greatly in Oregon's milder climate, spent his days with Dawson, father and son reconnecting as they worked together on final improvements to the ranch. Katherine divided her time between the two houses, spending her days at the ranch and returning to town each evening with Aunt Harriet, maintaining the proprieties even as her heart remained with Dawson. On the morning of Christmas Eve, Dawson arrived at Aunt Harriet's house earlier than usual, a mysterious smile playing about his lips. "I have something to show you," he told Katherine as he helped her into the wagon. "A surprise." "Another one," she laughed. Just the day before, he had presented her with a beautiful saddle for the mare he'd been training especially for her. "The best one," he promised, his eyes twinkling with excitement. They drove to the ranch in comfortable silence, the world around them hushed and white with fresh snow. As they approached, Katherine noticed activity around the barn. Several horses and wagons were tied outside, and she could see figures moving about. "Dawson, what's happening?" she asked, curiosity piqued. "You'll see," was all he would say as he helped her down and led her toward the barn. As they entered, Katherine gasped in astonishment. The interior had been transformed. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the space. The floor had been swept clean, and tables lined one wall, covered with white cloths and decorated with pine branches and red berries. At the far end, a small platform had been constructed, adorned with more evergreens and ribbons. "Dawson, what is this?" she breathed, taking in the scene. "This," he said, squeezing her hand, "is where we're getting married, tomorrow." "But I thought we were having the ceremony in the house," she said, confused but delighted by the transformation. "We were, until I realized how many people wanted to come. The house is too small." He gestured around the barn. "So the neighbors helped me prepare this instead. The Johnson boys and the Millers, even some folks from town. Everyone wanted to help make our day special." Tears filled Katherine's eyes as she took in the evidence of such community goodwill. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "There's more," he said, leading her outside and around to the back of the barn. There, in the shelter of the building, stood a brand new sleigh, painted a deep green with gold trim, the seats upholstered in rich burgundy leather. "Dawson," she exclaimed, running her hand along the gleaming wood. "It's magnificent, I thought," he said, watching her reaction with pleasure, "that we might like to ride to church on Sundays in style. And maybe someday take our children for rides on winter evenings." Katherine turned to him, her heart so full she could barely speak. "I love you, Dawson Lawson," she said simply, "more than I have words to express." He gathered her into his arms, his kiss a promise of all the days to come. "Tomorrow," he murmured against her lips, "tomorrow you'll be my wife." "Tomorrow," she agreed, her smile radiant with joy. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the world outside sparkling with new fallen snow. In Aunt Harriet's house, Katherine dressed with trembling fingers, her aunt and Mrs. Lawson helping her with the buttons of her ivory satin gown and arranging her veil. "You look beautiful, dear," Aunt Harriet said, her usual briskness softened by emotion. "Absolutely beautiful." "Your mother would be so proud," Mrs. Lawson added, adjusting the veil one last time. "As would your father if he could see the happiness you found." Katherine wasn't so sure about that last part, but she appreciated the sentiment. "Thank you both," she said, embracing each woman in turn, "for everything." A knock at the door announced the arrival of Mr. Lawson, who had volunteered to escort Katherine to the ranch in Dawson's stead, maintaining the tradition that the groom should not see his bride before the ceremony. "The sleigh is ready, Miss Katherine," he said, his eyes widening appreciatively at the sight of her. "And if I may say so, my son is the luckiest man in Montana." The journey to the ranch was like something from a fairy tale, the sleigh gliding smoothly over the snow, the horses' harnesses adorned with bells that jingled merrily with each step, the winter landscape glistening in the midday sun. As they approached the ranch, Katherine could see dozens of horses and wagons already arrived, the barn full to bursting with what appeared to be half the population of Stillwater. "Ready?" Mr. Lawson asked as they drew to a halt. Katherine took a deep breath, her heart pounding with anticipation. "I've been ready for 7 years," she answered truthfully. Inside the barn, every available space was filled with friends, neighbors, and well-wishers. Lanterns and candles created a warm, golden atmosphere despite the winter chill, and someone was playing a fiddle softly near the makeshift altar. As Katherine appeared at the entrance on Mr. Lawson's arm, a hush fell over the gathering. All eyes turned to the bride, resplendent in ivory satin and lace, her cheeks flushed with happiness and the cold air. But Katherine had eyes only for Dawson, who stood waiting for her at the altar, tall and handsome in his new suit, his face alight with love and wonder as he watched her approach. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving. Reverend Miller spoke of love's endurance, of promises kept despite time and distance, of God's plan that sometimes took winding paths but led to joy in the end. When it came time for the vows, Dawson's voice rang out clear and steady, his eyes never leaving Katherine's face as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her all the days of his life. Katherine, in turn, pledged herself to him with equal fervor, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed barn as she promised to be his faithful wife, his partner in all things, for as long as they both should live. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Miller proclaimed, beaming at the couple, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Dawson, you may kiss your bride." The gathered crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Dawson took Katherine in his arms, sealing their union with a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and devotion. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Food and drink flowed freely. Music and dancing filled the barn with life and laughter, and everywhere Katherine looked, she saw smiling faces and goodwill. As twilight fell, Dawson took her hand and led her away from the festivities, toward the house that was now truly their home. "Happy, Mrs. Lawson?" he asked as they stood on the porch, the sounds of celebration drifting from the barn while the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "And you, Mr. Lawson, any regrets?" "Only that we lost those 7 years," he said, his arms tightening around her. "But we have the rest of our lives to make up for it." "The rest of our lives," she echoed, lifting her face for his kiss. "Forever, just like you promised." Dawson lifted her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold of their home into the warmth and light that awaited them. "Forever," he agreed, his eyes full of promise. "And I always keep my promises." 5 years later, the train whistle pierced the summer air, announcing its approach to Stillwater station. On the platform, Dawson Lawson shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes fixed on the bend in the tracks where the locomotive would first appear. Beside him, Katherine adjusted the bonnet of their 3-year-old daughter, Eliza, who squirmed impatiently in her mother's arms. "Is the train coming, Papa?" asked 5-year-old William, his small hand clutching Dawson's much larger one. "Any minute now, son," Dawson assured him, ruffling the boy's dark hair so like his own with his free hand. "And Grandma and Grandpa will be on it," William persisted, excitement making him even more talkative than usual. "Yes, and your cousin James too," Katherine reminded him. "Aunt Clara's boy, remember?" Dawson glanced at his wife, marveling as he often did at how motherhood had only enhanced her beauty. At 30, Katherine possessed a quiet confidence and grace that made her even more striking than the girl he had fallen in love with all those years ago. The past 5 years had been the happiest of Dawson's life. The ranch had prospered under their joint care, expanding to include more cattle, better horses, and improved facilities. Their home had grown as well, with the additions they had planned and more besides, to accommodate their growing family and frequent visitors. William had arrived less than a year after their wedding, a strong, healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's amber-flecked eyes. Eliza had followed 2 years later, a dainty child with golden curls and a determined spirit that kept both parents on their toes. Now Katherine's sister Clara was coming for an extended visit, bringing her husband James Preston and their 7-year-old son from their home in Denver. It would be the first time the sisters had seen each other in nearly 3 years, and Katherine had been preparing for weeks, ensuring everything would be perfect for their stay. The sound of the approaching train grew louder, and William bounced on his toes with excitement. "I see it, Papa." "I see it." Sure enough, the locomotive appeared around the bend, steam billowing as it made its way toward the station. Dawson felt a surge of pride as he looked at the depot, no longer the dilapidated building it had been when he'd returned to Stillwater 10 years ago, but a proper station befitting the growing town. Stillwater itself had changed too, expanding with new businesses, better roads, even a proper school building where Katherine taught twice a week, sharing her love of literature with the town's children. The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a final blast of its whistle. Passengers began to disembark, some familiar faces among them the Peterson boys returning from college in the East, old Mrs. Whitmore back from visiting her daughter in California. Then Clara appeared on the steps, a slender woman with the same chestnut hair as Katherine, though without the auburn highlights. Behind her came her husband, tall and distinguished in his city clothes, and their son James, looking around with wide-eyed curiosity. "Clara," Katherine called, waving her free arm while balancing Eliza on her hip. The sisters' reunion was joyful and tearful, with exclamations over how much the children had grown and how well everyone looked. Dawson greeted his brother-in-law warmly. James Preston was a good man, a banker by profession, but with a genuine interest in ranching that Dawson appreciated. Young James and William sized each other up with the caution of boys meeting for the first time, while Eliza regarded her older cousin with solemn curiosity from the safety of her mother's arms. "Let me help with your trunks," Dawson offered, already moving toward the baggage car. "I'll come with you," James Preston said, following his lead. As the men dealt with the luggage, Katherine and Clara settled on a bench with the children, catching up on family news and admiring each other's offspring. "You look so happy, Katie," Clara said, using the childhood nickname that only she was permitted to use. "Motherhood agrees with you." "It does," Katherine agreed, smoothing Eliza's curls. "Though I won't pretend it's always easy, especially with this little whirlwind." "And the ranch?" "It's doing well, better than well," Katherine said proudly. "Dawson has a way with horses. His stock is becoming known throughout the territory, and we've expanded the cattle operation too." Clara's expression turned thoughtful. "Do you ever regret it?" Choosing this life instead of returning to society in Helena after Thomas died, Katherine looked at her sister in genuine surprise. "Regret it? Not for a single moment. This is where I belong, Clara, with Dawson, with our children, on the land we've built together." "I can see that," Clara smiled, watching as Dawson approached with a trunk balanced easily on one shoulder, James Preston struggling slightly with a smaller case behind him. "He still looks at you as though you hung the moon." "The feeling is mutual," Katherine assured her, rising to help organize the luggage for the journey to the ranch. With trunks and passengers loaded into the Lawsons' large wagon, they set off through town, the children chattering excitedly as Katherine pointed out the changes since Clara's last visit. "The new school building," she indicated, "and there's a proper doctor's office now, next to the apothecary. Oh, and the Grand Hotel has been renovated. They have indoor plumbing now, if you can believe it. Almost civilized," James Preston remarked with good humor. "Though I must say, the air here is certainly better than in Denver. The city grows more crowded every year." "You should consider moving back," Dawson suggested, only half joking. "There's good land available still, and the railroad makes it easier to do business here than it used to be." As they left the town behind and headed toward the ranch, Katherine found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. 10 years ago, she had stepped off a train much like today's, a young widow returning to her hometown with little hope for happiness. And there had been Dawson, waiting for her as though the years had never separated them. Now, with her husband beside her, their children healthy and thriving, her sister's family come to visit their prosperous ranch, Katherine felt a contentment so deep it bordered on awe. The girl who had once let others decide her fate had found her voice, her strength, and her true path. The ranch came into view, much changed from the modest homestead of their early married life. The cabin had expanded into a proper house, with a wide veranda wrapping around 3 sides. The barn was larger, the corrals more numerous, and a bunkhouse stood nearby to accommodate the hands they now employed during the busiest seasons. "Oh, Katherine," Clara breathed, taking in the scene. It's beautiful. Home, Katherine said simply, reaching over to squeeze Dawson's hand where it rested on the wagon seat between them. He returned the pressure, giving her the smile that, even after 5 years of marriage, still made her heart skip a beat. Home, he agreed. As they approached the house, Katherine saw Mrs. Johnson from the neighboring ranch coming down the steps, having stayed behind to finish preparations for the guests' arrival. "Everything's ready," she called as the wagon drew to a halt. "Beds made up, dinner in the oven, just as you asked." "You're a treasure, Mrs. Johnson," Katherine said gratefully, accepting the older woman's help with Eliza while Dawson lifted William down from the wagon. The next hour was a flurry of activity showing Clara and James to their room, settling young James in the space he would share with William, washing up for dinner, and finally gathering around the large table in the dining room that had been Dawson's first expansion project after William's birth. Conversation flowed easily over the excellent meal, with James Preston asking interested questions about the ranch's operations, and Clara catching Katherine up on news of friends and acquaintances back east. After dinner, with the children put to bed despite protestations that they weren't tired, the adults moved to the comfortable parlor. Dawson built up the fire against the evening chill while Katherine poured coffee and served the apple pie Mrs. Johnson had baked that morning. "I still can't quite believe it," Clara said, looking around at the well-appointed room with its bookshelves, comfortable furniture, and tasteful decorations. "My little sister, the society wife from Helena, living the life of a rancher's wife in Stillwater and clearly thriving." "It surprised a few people," Katherine admitted with a smile. "Aunt Harriet most of all, I think, though she's come around splendidly." "How is the old girl?" James Preston asked, accepting a cup of coffee. "Still ruling Stillwater society with an iron fist, more or less," Dawson chuckled. "Though she's mellowed somewhat since becoming a great aunt. She spoils the children shamelessly whenever they visit." The conversation continued late into the evening, the siblings and in-laws reconnecting with the ease of family who, despite distance and different lives, remain fundamentally connected. As Clara stifled a yawn, Katherine rose to show their guests to their room, leaving Dawson to bank the fire for the night. Later, as she prepared for bed in their comfortable bedroom, Katherine found herself thinking again of that day at the depot 10 years ago. How lost she had felt, how uncertain of her future. And then Dawson had been there, solid and real, offering to carry her trunk, and though she hadn't known it then, her heart as well. "Penny for your thoughts," Dawson said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Katherine leaned back against his chest, meeting his gaze in the mirror. "I was thinking about the day I came back to Stillwater, about seeing you at the depot. The best day of my life," he said, pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck, "until the day you agreed to marry me. And the day William was born, and the day Eliza arrived." He smiled against her skin. "I seem to have a lot of best days with you." Katherine turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face, still handsome though lined now with the evidence of outdoor work and laughter. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been there that day? If we hadn't found each other again?" Dawson considered the question, his eyes serious. "Sometimes. But then I think it was always meant to be, Katherine. We were always meant to find our way back to each other." "I believe that too," she said softly. "Even in the darkest times when I thought I'd never see you again, some part of me held on to hope." "Hope," he repeated, drawing her closer. "It's a powerful thing." "So is love," she murmured, rising on tiptoe to kiss him, her heart as full as it had been on their wedding day. Later, lying in the darkness with Dawson's steady breathing beside her, Katherine thought of all they had built together, not just the ranch and the house, but the life they shared, the family they had created, the love that had withstood separation and found its way home. 10 years ago, at a dusty depot in a small Montana town, a cowboy had found his first love again and promised her forever. It was a promise he had kept every day since, in ways both large and small. And Katherine, who had once let others chart her course, had found the courage to claim her own happiness. Outside their window, under the vast Montana sky filled with stars, the land they loved stretched out in all directions, a testament to dreams fulfilled and promises kept. And within the walls of their home, the family they had created slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Forever, after all, was turning out to be even better than they had imagined.